Bomberman 64. No, not that one. Or that one. Or even that one. Come on, we never even got that one. No, I mean this one. Although it has some interesting comparisons with that last one. See, that last Bomberman game was the very final N64 game to ever be produced. It used, in its entirety, nothing but 2D sprites, and it was a very traditional Bomberman game. This game happens to be one of the earliest N64 games that I'm familiar with, uses 3D polygons out the wazoo, and is an adventure game. It was kind of breaking the mold for the series in its entirety. In fact, the reason why I have to specify which game I'm talking about at the start is because of that last game. See, that game was called Bomberman 64, because despite the fact there were 3 more ahead of it, Japan never used that name, which is why you see that little Japanese character in front of this game's title, hence the full name Baku Bomberman 64. And this was a pretty important game because, first of all, like I said, it was the first Bomberman game to use 3D polygons, it was the first Bomberman adventure game, and it was a very early N64 game, but for me personally, this was my first introduction to Bomberman. I remember standing in a Toys R Us when I was getting my N64 way back in the day, with a game in each hand, in one hand Banjo-Kazooie, in the other Bomberman 64. And in the end, I went with Banjo-Kazooie. I think that was the right choice, but I always wanted to play this one. And now ironically, I don't have Banjo-Kazooie anymore, but I definitely have this one. And it's a fun game, but it being the first N64 Bomberman game, it being the first polygonal Bomberman game, it being the first Bomberman adventure game, you can feel the growing pains with this one quite a lot. Now the story, and stop me if you've heard this one before, features Planet Bomber in trouble. 4 dastardly bombers, all named after different stars: Orion, a green jerk who we'll get to later, Artemis, the token girl, Altair, the boss and owner of a cool black mask that affords him a second life, and of course the coolest character this side of Kurobon, our boy Regulus, have decided to invade Planet Bomber using the power of the Omni Cube, this godly device that will allow them to control the universe, and they slowly start ripping Planet Bomber in half. Now Bomberman, he needs help, so he teams up with his new, completely 100% legit best friend, Sirius, to take them down. Now, Bomberman 64 has a very, very basic story. It's definitely nowhere near as complex as, say, Second Attack, its sequel, or even Bomberman Hero, despite the fact that that was basically just a complete one-for-one retread of Star Wars. There is a total of, I think, like 3 cutscenes in the game, 2 of which are hidden behind basically completing the game 100%, and otherwise you have like 3 paragraphs given to you by Sirius if you choose to find them in certain levels. That's kind of your story. It's not much. I do definitely appreciate that they at least show us the threat that Planet Bomber is facing, although I kind of wish it was a playable sequence, honestly. You know, I always prefer do, don't, show, as opposed to show, don't, tell, but, you know, show, don't, tell is still appreciated. Overall, the story itself is very, very simple. It's not very complicated, although there are a couple twists and turns here and there, but, you know, for the most part, it's a Bomberman plot. You're not going to get a ton out of it. Certainly not as much as its sequel, but it's, for what it is, it's decent. Now, the gameplay to Bomberman 64 is absolutely a very, very early adventure game in the Bomberman world, and it feels like it because it doesn't necessarily feel like they know what they're doing with it just yet. They haven't really discovered what Bomberman adventure games really mean. This was the first one, after all, and because of that, it kind of breaks a lot of traditions that later games would establish. For one thing, this is the only Bomberman game where Bomberman has 1 health, and that actually creates an interesting dynamic because unlike other Bomberman games where you can take a few hits and you have to explore all these big worlds and try and avoid enemies and stuff, it feels like they were still designing it with the idea that your biggest threat is yourself, that you're going to be walking down these narrow corridors trying to strategically take out your opponents without killing yourself. Except that for the most part there are no corridors in this game. It's mostly a very open environment to attack your enemies. Conversely, because they didn't want enemies to be your biggest threat, because again, they were kind of working with the idea that you are your biggest threat, most enemies don't hurt you. They stun you, which requires you to rotate the control stick really, really fast to get up, but they don't kill you, which gives you almost sort of a sense of invulnerability in this game a lot of time, because you're probably not hurting yourself too much, at least by design, and the enemies aren't doing it too much either. Now granted, this also helps emphasize the explorative nature. You're not running around necessarily destroying enemies and blowing stuff up so much as you are adventuring through these worlds and exploring them, and I definitely do appreciate that, but it feels a little bit at odds with its own mechanics. In addition to this, we have the bombs, which act very, very differently than previous iterations. Bombs no longer explode in a cross pattern, but more of a three-dimensional bubble. And that's not necessarily a bad idea, except that this game, I don't know if it actually is or not, but it feels like it's still designed with that sort of standard grid-based system, and using three-dimensional bubbles in a square grid system makes it a little bit weird to try and figure out where hitboxes are. Sometimes you'll swear you're outside the range of your bombs and it won't look like you get hit, but you still do, as well as it feels like you're gonna get hit by enemies sometimes when it feels like you're nowhere near their hitbox. It's a little bit weird. It's something you can overcome and get used to after a little while, but it definitely takes a little bit of getting used to. In addition, while we're talking about bombs, this is the only Bomberman adventure game where you only have your standard bombs. This was the first Bomberman game, as far as I'm aware, where you had inherently the ability to pick up and throw bombs as well as kick them from the start. No power-ups needed here. You get that ability day one, level one. I appreciate that, actually. In fact, they added an additional ability, pumped bombs, which is something I absolutely love, where you pick up and hold the bomb and it gets bigger and bigger, and it does more damage, and can be used to open up various bits of the environment. You're probably not going to be seeing too much of that here, because I'm actually using an endgame ability that gives you like superpower bombs, just for the sake of speeding up recording footage, but they're like the next stage up. And you can pump them up too, and it makes you feel awesome. And honestly, that's one of the things I don't like about this game, is just kind of the lack of variety of bombs. I mean, I know a lot of people like to dump on Bomberman Hero, which, stop dumping on Bomberman Hero, that game is awesome. But even Bomberman Hero had 3 different types of bombs. This one, you've got your standard bombs, and that's it. Granted, you can use them in a few different ways, and in fact, they designed a few different puzzles around utilizing your bombs in clever ways, creating them as a set of stairs to try and climb up larger bits of the environment, and that's something you're going to have to get used to because this game requires it later on. But while I have to commend their creativity with what you have to work with, you still don't have a lot to work with, and that means that puzzles in this game have to be inherently very simplistic, or they just kind of get insane. And now I guess is about the time where I mention this game happens to have 4 starting worlds. You can select which one you want to go to at the start. Once you complete those 4, you unlock a 5th world, which is sort of like the final area, and if you happen to complete all of that and collect all the hidden collectibles, you unlock a 6th area. I cannot stand that 6th area. I have beaten this game through several times, but I just refuse to do the actual like adventure levels of that final world, just because it is mostly trying to climb sheer walls just using staircases out of bombs and stunning yourself. And while it's certainly very possible to do, it is just dumb and infuriating. It's interesting to see how far they're willing to take a very simplistic mechanic, and I think they do it excellently, but at the same time, just because they utilize it well doesn't mean it's fun. It is just kind of taken to an absurd level and is just unpleasant. You might recall my playthrough of this game where I even showed that world, showed one of those levels off, and then like skipped all the adventuring bits because screw that level. That whole final world's adventuring segment is just awful. The progression between these areas is actually pretty neat as well. Usually you can see the next area that you're progressing to from your current level, and in turn it feels like you're in one giant interconnected world. The weird thing is that the first world, or at least the suggested first world, you can pick any of the initial 4 worlds in whatever order you like, but the one that has the tutorial to it, the green grass garden area, that one feels a little bit disconnected from the rest because the levels just end when you collect a diamond and then I guess you're done. Whereas you compare it to the ice stage and you're taking chairlifts to the next area. In fact, you can even see the boss arena from the penultimate area. It's a really neat small touch, but it helps make the world feel a lot more alive. Each world also happens to feature tons of little secret areas. I know that the ice world had like walls you could walk through to find little secret areas. I know the grass world happened to have like all these little secret shrines and areas you could find stuff in. It's a good time to explore these areas, even though if you ignore that, you can get through the world pretty quick. There's a surprising amount of depth given the simplicity of these levels, and I definitely appreciate that. This game doesn't necessarily feel like it understands its own mechanics at times. You know that sort of bomb staircasing I was sort of chiding the final area for? Well, if you do a very basic version of that in the first area of the water world, you can clear that stage in about 12 seconds. Like, the exit is right next to a button that's right next to the entrance, that if you just bomb staircase up, you can skip the entire world. And it's not a complicated bomb staircase, mind you, it requires like 3 bombs. So even just trying to explore the concept for the first time, you can get through that level like stupid quick. It's really weird. If you'd like another example of how just sort of ignored the mechanics of this game are sometimes, well, spoilers for like the next 15 seconds or so, but this is the first stage of the final boss. The first stage of the final boss is now complete. Yeah, you can just take that form out without ever actually attacking it. I don't know if that's trying to reward clever understanding of what you're supposed to be doing, sort of like accidentally knocking the wind guy from the sequel to this game into the fire pit behind him. Like, maybe that's supposed to be like a secret to, you know, reward creativity, but at the same time it feels like they just sort of forgot their own mechanics for a minute. It was very odd to run into this for the first time. Actually, while we're on this subject, let's talk about the bosses, because these worlds are all set up in a very similar fashion. Each of the 4 initial worlds has 2 adventuring levels, level 1 and level 3, and 2 boss fights. Level 2 will feature one of the Bomberman characters, and level 3 will feature, weirdly, I think some sort of like natural fauna from the world their chunk of land was ripped out of, because they don't really fit anywhere else. The final 2 stages kind of swap this up, with the Bomberman character being the final boss and the sort of natural guardian being the second boss, but that's neither here nor there. The Bomberman fights are really weirdly paced, because with the exception of Regulus and your training match with Sirius at the beginning, they all fight differently. Like, they all have ranged attacks, or they all have like tricks. And in a lot of cases, these tricks almost make it feel a little bit unfair. Not a ton, but definitely a little bit, especially in Orion's case. This guy will run up to you and then stun you. He will then pick you up and throw you in the lava. And because this is Bomberman, pretty much your best bet is just to drop bombs behind you and hope he runs into them, which will then usually have him like kick them at you and then stun you and then pick you up and throw you in the lava. And they have about 3 times as much health as you, so they can play it a little bit riskier than you can, even if you happen to find the heart power up. In addition, characters like Artemis have the ability to throw ranged attacks at you. And there's an important reason why these Bomberman characters have like all these special abilities, because if you fight actual Bomberman characters like they're Bomberman characters, it is really bloody easy and boring. I mean, the initial fight with Sirius is very bland, as well as fighting Regulus, who's supposed to be Bomberman's like super secret rival and like continues his rivalry in the sequel. You know, his special ability is a melee attack, which basically requires him to get up right next to you anyway, just like a standard Bomberman character. That changes literally nothing. And his fight ends in about 10 seconds, every single time. And they end even faster if you happen to have the remote power-up, which, I mean, with super-powered bombs like I have here, it's a bad example, of course, but inherent remote kind of completely destroys them. The bigger bosses, I think, are a lot more interesting. They're certainly a lot more intimidating, and they're created using various segments. For example, the first boss is a dragon with a head, a tail, 2 wings, and if you attack all of these different things, you can actually hinder its abilities. You can burn its wings off, you can hurt its head, and it will affect the way it fights. A better example is actually the fire area boss, which is this giant robot. If you destroy both its hands, it can't use its hand attacks. So maybe it'll start using its head attack. Well, you can take off its hat and suddenly it can't use that, so it's stuck using its little like laser beams. It's really interesting to see these enemies get taken apart piece by piece and have to change up their strategies, and it's really empowering to do so. I love these bosses. And in addition, like the Bomberman characters, and I haven't really talked about this, but the standard levels have these sort of hidden for the most part as well. In finding like these hidden weak points and stuff, you unlock special gold cards, and if you collect them all, you unlock the final world, so you kind of need to. And I think that's really cool to have like these hidden collectibles that are just based around experimenting and slowly destroying your opponents. So while the mini Bomberman fights are kind of really lackluster and uninteresting, the big bosses, those are the fun ones. Also, anyone out there who's played this game before, maybe I'm crazy, feel free to correct me, but I remember the first time playing this way back in the day. the ice boss, there was just some way you could skip its second form. I remember the ground falling out underneath you, Sirius catching you, dropping you on a ledge, and just basically ending the mission. But every time I play this, that doesn't happen, so maybe I'm misremembering, but I swear that happened. I don't know. This game also happens to feature the standard Bomberman arcade mode, although it has an additional little feature that, as far as I'm aware, is the first time in a Bomberman game, custom Bombermans. And I love this feature. It allows you to take various custom parts you find by exploring the world and uncovering them. They're secret items for the most part, and then applying them to your Bomberman to create a custom look. Like my Dragon Knight Bomberman here, for example. One thing I don't like is some of these are rewards for basically like doing achievement type stuff, with the most coveted one, of course, being the gold armor of the game. A thing I have earned all of once, and I can't even show it here because my save data got corrupted, but you have to beat the game 100% in less than 3 hours, which is kind of tough because that requires you to collect all the gold cards, and some gold cards require you to destroy an absurd number of enemies in each level, while at the same time other ones require you to beat the level very quickly. And, you know, at the risk of pointing out the obvious, those two goals are kind of opposing each other, so at best you have to play through every stage twice, and that's after understanding how each stage is supposed to be progressed. It's a bit of an undertaking, and again, then you have to do that all for Rainbow Palace. No, thank you. I did that once, never again. But the custom Bomberman feature is neat. The only thing I don't like about it is that it doesn't carry over into the main game. I would love to run around the adventure world in this custom Bomberman armor. I think it would be so super cool to have your own custom Bomberman be the hero of this game. And there's not really any particular excuse for that not being the case. Its sequel, Bomberman 64 Second Attack, did the same thing, but the story mode had its own set of armor, so it made sense. Here there's just no real reason not to be able to use your own custom armor. And the fact that it's not is kind of disappointing. But that said, the arcade mode in general is a blast, as it always is. Although again, using three-dimensional explosions as opposed to the cross explosions does mean that your strategy has to vary up a little bit more. And of course, not being in the tight corridors that you're used to, it does mean that this arcade mode is a little bit more awkward and a little bit less traditional than you're probably expecting. Still fun though. Another thing that goes absolutely hand in hand with early 3D games, especially on the N64, is the camera work in this game is terrible. I mean, half the time I just end up looking at like the broad side of a wall and I have to like move the camera using like the C buttons, and it's not really all that great. Your camera can only be in like 4 potential positions around your Bomberman character, and while, yeah, sure, being able to move the camera is certainly advantageous, it never feels like you can actually see any significant amount of the battlefield, let alone the camera getting stuck in walls and stuff and just looking horrible while you accidentally get murdered because you can't see where you're going. It's not great. Overall, the gameplay to Bomberman 64 is definitely unique. It is the first of its kind after all, and it doesn't necessarily work in every single way, but you can definitely feel like they're experimenting and they're trying, and while a lot of mechanics don't feel like they're terribly well implemented and are sometimes at odds with itself, it's still a fun game. But that said, you can definitely still feel a lot of room for growth and a lot of potential that's not quite utilized just yet. The overall presentation to Bomberman 64 is, again, sort of in that sort of awkward teenage puberty, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm just trying to find my way sort of thing. It definitely feels like there's some growing pains here as well. For example, Bomberman's face is a paper-thin flat plane hovering in front of a round object. The arms on the giant fire robot are just round sprites that are constantly facing the camera, like in, say, Doom. It feels like visually they're trying to shortcut a lot of things, probably because they didn't really know what they could do with the hardware at this point. That's kind of at least my assumption. If you can get past the possibly self-imposed technical limitations of this game, though, it's still quite pretty. All the different worlds have their own different feel. The water world definitely feels like a relaxing vacation place, whereas the dark fortress at the end feels very, very oppressive, and the Rainbow Palace feels like this solemn, reverent, but also really creepy environment. I quite like the ruins in the green world, as well as the sort of winter resort as well, although that said, I could not stand the fire level. Like, this game does go with the very simple fire, ice, grass, water, then like tower, then like fortress stage layouts. It's very simple, and it doesn't really go beyond that, and they're not utilized in the most interesting way, but they have their own unique sense of aesthetic, plus they all have their own unique enemies. I think it works pretty well. If a little bit underwhelming. Audio-wise, though, there is nothing you can really complain about here. Maybe the voice acting, because it's kind of heavily compressed and awkward, but that said, there's like maybe an entire paragraph of dialogue across this entire game shared by all the characters. I think each character gets like maybe 2 words in. I think Bomberman gets like 5 words in across the entire game. That was close and I did it. Yeah, that's all of Bomberman's dialogue in the entire game. So there's not a ton of voice acting, but it is a little bit heavily compressed and it's not that great, but there's not a lot to complain about. However, the soundtrack, tremendous. It is iconic for the N64. I love the soundtrack to this game. It is just some of the best. I think the only song in this soundtrack that I could probably give a pass on is the Fireworld theme. Again, just everything about that Fireworld kind of sucks. The soundtrack to this game is amazing, and I think the soundtrack alone is a reason to own this game because it is just iconic for the N64, I think. Now, if you want a copy of Bomberman 64 on the N64, not to be confused with the other 3 Bomberman 64s on the N64, cheapest one I'm seeing right now is $20 before shipping. With shipping, it's like $30. Wow! This game has gone up in price quite a lot. When I got my copy, that was quite a ways ago, but still, I remember the most expensive this game ever got was like $15, shipping included. Kinda surprised, honestly. Do I think it's worth it? If you're into Bomberman, yeah, because I think it's an important milestone. If you love Bomberman adventure games, it's a no-brainer. I think this is one of the most important Bomberman games in the world. It certainly is to me, just because it's sort of my introduction to this series. I definitely got in late on this. And without this game, I probably would not have the love of Bomberman adventure games that I do today. That said, it's not perfect, and if you can happen to find Bomberman Hero or Second Attack, which good luck because that game costs an absolute fortune, for the same price or less, grab them instead because, well, this game is good and it's important and I think it's a staple in any classic N64 library. Those ones are just better Bomberman adventure games. But that said, this was the one that kicked it all off, and while there's certainly a lot of growing pains with it, Bomberman 64 is still a very, very cool game. And while I think it's definitely nowhere near as strong as any of the other games in this particular genre of Bomberman, with, of course, the exception probably of being Bomberman Quest, because that one is pretty rough. This one is an absolute must-have, because while it certainly has its growing pains, you gotta start somewhere, and I think this game kicked off Bomberman's adventuring days with a bang.